Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for our third lecture, and thank you for braving the very cold rain to be here tonight. We are absolutely delighted to have you. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Megan Bever. I am Vice President of the Sherwood Rader Farm Civil War Park and Associate Professor of History here at Missouri Southern State University. This speaker series is presented by the Sherwood Rader Farm Civil War Park, which interprets the May 1863 engagement between Federal soldiers and Confederate partisans that left many Black Union soldiers dead. The park also seeks to foster an understanding of the border conflict that raged along the Missouri-Kansas border during the Civil War and to promote the preservation of battlefields and historic sites. We hope that you will take time to learn about the park by visiting the park itself or our Facebook page. This series would not be possible without the work of Bob Harrington, president of the Rader Farm Park Board, and Paul Tevereau and Virginia Lass, who serve on the organizing committee. In addition to support from the Rader Farm Board of Directors, we are grateful to Missouri Southern for partnering with us to host this event. We would like to thank specifically Brad Hodgson, Brad Belk, Missouri Southern's community historian, and also who both of them work with the Missouri Southern Foundation. Tonight's speaker, Jennifer M. Murray, is a military historian with a specialization in the American Civil War, and she works in the Department of History at Oklahoma State University. In addition to delivering hundreds of Civil War battlefield tours, Murray has led World War I and World War II study abroad trips to Europe. Her most recent publication is On a Great Battlefield, The Making, Management, and Memory of Gettysburg National Military Park, 1933 to 2013, published by the University of Tennessee Press in 2014. Murray is also the author of The Civil War Begins, published by the U.S. Army's Center of Military History in 2012. She is currently working on a full-length biography of George Gordon Meade, tentatively titled Meade at War. Murray is a veteran faculty member at Gettysburg College Civil War Institute and a coveted speaker at Civil War symposiums and roundtables. In addition, Murray worked as a seasonal interpretive park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park for 9 summers. Her lecture tonight is entitled Preserving and Interpreting America's Most Iconic Battlefield, Gettysburg. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan, and thank you all for coming out this evening. As Megan said, the weather is less than desirable. I had a smooth trip over to from Stillwater, and I'm happy to be with you all tonight, sharing my research and my interests on the Gettysburg battlefield. You all can hear me okay? Everything's okay on the mic? Thumbs up? Right, that's what my students do. Thumbs up. Let me start my talk tonight by asking you, and I think this is a pretty veteran group, so you should all be affirmative in your answer. You've been to the Gettysburg battlefield? Show of hands. All right, that's almost everybody. And many of you are repeat visitors? Show of hands. Okay, good group. So we'll talk tonight about a landscape that you are pretty familiar with, have personal recollections of, a very important place in American history. I like to start my talk tonight, or anytime I talk about Gettysburg, just by giving you a conversation about how I became interested in this topic. This is the cover of my book, and let me flip to some of the iconic modern and historic preservation photos of Gettysburg. The bottom right is a photograph of Cemetery Ridge today. The top right is an aerial photograph of the peach orchard. This is the central point of attack on July the 2nd for the Confederate offensive. And then the big image on the left is this modern day commercial obstruction that generated, I was thinking of a nice word to say that generated a lot of controversy when it went up and then generated a lot of controversy when it went down in the early 21st century. I'm an East Coaster. I grew up in Maryland, not very far from Gettysburg or Antietam, and my interest in the Civil War came as an undergraduate. Particularly, I had the opportunity to intern at Gettysburg National Military Park in 2002. And from that internship, I ended up going back to Gettysburg for 8 more summers as a seasonal park ranger through graduate school, through the MA, and through the PhD. So for me, you all have these same kind of stories, right? How you get interested in the Civil War, what draws you in. For me, it was the opportunity to be on that battlefield and meet tens of thousands of people from around the world and share my passion with people like you. And that's a special privilege. So that took me through my graduate program. It took me, my PhD's from Auburn, and it took me to my dissertation topic. And some of you are familiar with the way the academic world works. You're supposed to promote or produce something original in your dissertation, right? Some original idea. So I went in one day after I'd taken my exams, and I was talking with my dissertation director, Ken No, about what I was going to write my dissertation on. I said, Dr. No, I got a great idea. I'm going to write my dissertation on Gettysburg. And of course, he's like, well, Jen, that's great. That's not been done 10,000 times, right? Original ideas is the key word here. And just think in your mind, like think of your own bookshelves, or think of walking into Barnes and Nobles, or thinking of walking into a library. How many shelves are just devoted to Gettysburg? Your own houses, I bet, right? It is the most written about battle in the American Civil War, and one of the most written about conflicts, 72 hours, in American history. How many books have been, and this doesn't include journal articles, right? Just books, monographs. How many books do you think have been written on Gettysburg? Full-length monographs. Don't count journal articles like the glossies, like Civil War Times and stuff like that. Just American, yeah, just American. And we're gonna get specific. Like, what do you want? What do you want? Just American authors just writing on Gettysburg. Just throw out a number. Just 200. Do I hear? Oh, or up, down. What do you think? More up? No fewer than 6,000 books have been written on. I mean, we have books now about the books of Gettysburg, okay, right? And if you can think about these collections, there are campaign monographs, there are books that's written just on particular days. We have a lot written on July the 3rd, Pickett's Charge. We have books on the personalities. We have books on the environment. We have books on the animals. We have books on the horses at Gettysburg. You get the idea, right? So my research looks not at the battle, but the battlefield. And that's what I want to share with you all tonight about the landscape, which now the National Park Service manages just over 6,000 acres. And I want to take you through a journey of how the National Park Service, starting in 1933, but we'll rewind the clock, preserves this landscape and share with you some of the interesting points in my research, or some of the highlights, the greatest hits, if you will, the greatest hits. So one of the things we have to start with, and let's rewind to the Civil War era here just for a quick minute, is why Gettysburg is so iconic. It is more than any other Civil War battlefield, this is the place where Americans will visit. Gettysburg's visitation is just under 2 million each year. 2 million. So for many people who come to learn about Gettysburg, this is their one immersive experience to talk about the Civil War. Why? Why do they come there? So it's the bloodiest day, you know this, right? 51,000 casualties, leaps and bounds more than, or the bloodiest battle rather, leaps and bounds more than the other Civil War battles. So that makes it unique. This man on the image is a Massachusetts artillery officer who, after the Civil War is over, will become sort of a promotional campaign or a promotional face to encourage the Union war effort, or the Union soldiers to continue to rally around Union during Reconstruction. What did it cost me? That's his cost at Gettysburg. He's involved in the fight on July the 2nd. So it's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. This is an image of Confederate dead buried in these trench graves where they will lay on the battlefield until their remains, Union first and then Confederate, will be reinterred. Union soldiers going to the Soldiers' National Cemetery. But it's important at the time, and Civil War historians will debate, is Gettysburg the turning point? Right? These are the conversations that we endlessly debate. Is Gettysburg the turning point? And if you look at Northern newspapers in 1863, they'll proclaim Gettysburg to be similar to Waterloo. Now, we might brush over that today and not really delve into that, but in 1863, Waterloo 1815 is a battle in recent American memory. And it's a battle that has tremendous political and geostrategic implications. So the Battle of Gettysburg, fought by George Gordon Meade, my new research topic, is a Union victory. And it's a battle fought in a northern state. So as the Civil War is moving through 1863 and 1864, there's a surge of interest in Gettysburg to begin to preserve these battlegrounds. You've probably seen a photograph like this before, or maybe this exact one. This, of course, is the dedication day. Lincoln comes to Gettysburg November 19, 1863, with the idea or the explicit purpose to properly dedicate the cemetery where thousands of Union soldiers are buried. And in that 272-word address, Abraham Lincoln not only crafts a vision of what the American Civil War is, but he makes sure that Americans understand that those men who fought at Gettysburg, in his words, did not die in vain. So already in the fall of 1863, there's a movement for the Gettysburg residents, but also in the northern community writ large, that they associate Gettysburg as being different. It's a battle different than the last years of war and horror, ghastly effects. So, looking at the history of the Gettysburg battlefield, 3 administrators will manage and assume the responsibility, stewardship, for Gettysburg. My research focuses mostly on the National Park Service, beginning in 1933. That's the topic of my book. But we need to understand the first 2 eras, too. So the first preservation entity that will control or manage Gettysburg is the GBMA. And historians love dates, so if you're zoning in on the date, that's 1864. And that's worth noting because in 1864, what's going on? Still fighting the war. And in fact, the bloodiest campaigns are still yet to come, particularly in Virginia with the Overland Campaign. So in 1864, there's this grassroots movement that originates in Gettysburg that is of the belief that these landscapes, these fields, are worth preserving. And the GBMA will manage the battlefield until 1895. Then the federal government will step in, the United States War Department, and the War Department will manage Gettysburg until 1933, at which point Gettysburg and a few dozen other sites will be transferred to the National Park Service, whom owns or manages Gettysburg today. So our objective is to walk through, as I said, kind of the greatest hits, give you a big trajectory of what the preservation themes or narratives are at Gettysburg. That's our focus. And we'll start with the GBMA. If you visited the National Cemetery, you can envision this in your mind, and you walk into the center of it. There's that iconic Soldiers' National Monument. This is a photograph of its construction. The leading pioneers or the stewards for the GBMA are local Gettysburg officials. Lawyers, particularly in Adams County, will be the movers and shakers that have the idea to start preserving these battlefield grounds. And foremost in that conversation is David McConaughey. And here in August, just 2 months after the battle, McConaughey says there could be no more fitting expressive memorial to the honors of the Union soldiers, the victor of the Army of the Potomac, than the battlefield itself. So they write up a charter, and they're going to start buying the earliest battlefield grounds. So there's a grassroots movement going on, as you indicated, as the war is still going on. They'll oversee the transfer of the Union soldiers from the battlefield, like in those shallow graves I showed you, to the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And they'll also be responsible for erecting the parks or the battlefield's first monuments, like this one here in the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And by the time that the GBMA transfers stewardship to the War Department, they have preserved 522 acres. Right? That's not insignificant. 522 acres with a few asterisks. Most of the land that they've preserved are on the Union battle lines. Now that makes sense, right? It's a grassroots effort originating in Gettysburg, and it's a Union victory, so they're going to want to preserve the Union battle lines first. So they would start to buy up the properties along Cemetery Ridge, where George Meade and the Army of the Potomac were. They'll oversee some of the first monuments, and then they'll also lay out the first roads, if you will, really rudimentary tour route. That's their responsibility. But they're hamstringed in a lot of ways by something that you all could relate to in your own preservation efforts. What do you need first and foremost to really generate a preservation movement? You need money. and that's something that they don't have. So in 1895, they don't have in spades, let me say. In 1895, they will appeal to the War Department, and the War Department will willingly accept the 522 acres and take control or stewardship of Gettysburg battlefield. Now in the big scheme, think American history here, big picture with me for a second, first slide. This is the Jim Crow Gilded Age America, right? And this is the period where 25th anniversary, where veterans are having this surge of commemorative patriotism, Civil War monuments, erections, and dedications are really popular in the North and the South. And it's also the time where Civil War battlefields, Gettysburg included, are starting to be preserved by the national government. Gettysburg's not the first battlefield to get National Military Park status or federal government status. The first one is Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and it will be incorporated by the federal government in 1890. Then comes in Antietam, then comes in Shiloh, that's Burnside Bridge, of course. Gettysburg will become a National Military Park on February 11th, 1895. And one of the leading advocates, and some of you will get an extra chuckle out of this, one of the leading advocates that pushes for Gettysburg to be a national military park with federal backing is none other than Dan Sickles. I see some heads nodding. You remember Dan Sickles and his famous actions on July the 2nd, very contentious relationship with George Gordon Meade. Sickles is one of the leading proponents to get Gettysburg authorized by the War Department. And he makes that task in 1895, and then Vicksburg will come into the fold in 1899. All right, so those are the big five. This is a period, and we'll come to this in a couple ways through our walk tonight, through our program. This is the period of reconciliation, right? The seceded states are already back in the Union. That's reunion. And this period is reconciliation. This is an emotional and often an individual journey where Union and Confederate veterans, Northern and Southerners, are going to have to decide to come back together for the betterment of the nation. They're going to reconcile. And Civil War veterans are leading this conversation of reconciliation. So you'd find Gettysburg to be at the forefront in that conversation. This is a photograph taken from East Cemetery Hill in 1893. And it's a mixture of Union and Confederate veterans, and I've superimposed some of the names over the people, so I bet you can recognize some of these names. You can find, here's Dan Sickles, right, minus one leg, right, that's his July the 2nd sacrifice. Dan Sickles here. William Mahone, the leading Virginian, this is Mahone to our right. Here's James Longstreet, very prominent in the center. Now, Longstreet ends up becoming, remember your Civil War history, he ends up becoming really the scapegoat for Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. It doesn't help that he's very pro-Grant. He also kind of favors reconciliation and Reconstruction policies, but here he is. E.P. Alexander to our left, the young artillerist. Oliver Otis Howard, if we look a little bit further left, this is the leader of the Freedmen's Bureau. Oliver Otis Howard goes on to have a career in the U.S. military, moving the Nez Perce Indians towards the Canadian border, a little bit further down the line. And here's the governor of Pennsylvania. So you have pretty prominent Union and Confederate veterans coming here. And if you could drop yourself in this image, and if you could listen to what they're talking about, what would they be saying? What are they talking about in 1893? What stories would they be sharing? They're talking about romanticism, right? They're talking about the heroism of Union acts here, Confederate acts here. They're talking about the courage of Pickett's Charge. They're talking about the courage of the Union effort on Culp's Hill. They're sharing war stories, because that's what veterans do, right? They're swapping these conversations. What they are not talking about, what you would not find a conversation here is what? Use the S word, slavery. They're not going to be talking about slavery. They're not going to be talking about secession. They're not going to be talking about the unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction. Why? Because those topics are contentious. Those topics are contentious. So Civil War battlefields, and Gettysburg leads the nation in this way, become landscapes, and this is fascinating, because they become landscapes of healing, right? This is important, and it becomes important in the 20th century and today, because the veterans are responsible for shaping this national narrative that we have about the Civil War that really willingly will neglect the war's controversial issues in favor of a narrative where all are brave and all are true. Why? Because that helps reconciliation. We'll come back to this. And I think you already know where this conversation is going to go. So Gettysburg's the leading landscape of reconciliation, if you will. And Union and Confederate veterans alike will start showing more interest in Gettysburg as we move into the turn of the century. And 1913 is a big deal in Gettysburg. It's the 50th anniversary of the fight, and the President of the United States, here in the center, this is Woodrow Wilson. Remember, Woodrow Wilson's born in the South. He's born in Stanton, Virginia, and he's very much of this reconciliationist kind of mindset of a president with a lot of contentious, people seem to either love him or hate him. He will be the one who screens the birth of the nation in the White House. You know, this is the era of Jim Crow. Wilson says it's, oh, like writing lightning, that it is also true. So here he comes up to Gettysburg to be part of this big peace jubilee 50 years later. And tens of thousands of Union and Confederate veterans, and he's flanked by one on each side, will pour into Gettysburg for about 2 weeks, and they will roam the battlefield. Old aging veterans will charge up Little Round Top again or walk the fields at Pickett's Charge. Again, sharing these war stories. And one of the best examples or quotes that really capture for us what reconciliation is comes from the governor of Virginia. The governor of Virginia will come to Gettysburg also. He's here 50 years later. And this is his speech on July the 3rd, 1913, a part of it, a sentence. Governor Hodgman says, "We're not here to discuss the origins of the war. We're not here to discuss what caused the war. We're here to talk over the events of the battle, man to man." Right? Because that's something that everybody can agree on. Whether a Union or Confederate veteran, they could agree that their acts and their deeds are brave and true, and they could agree that their sacrifices were noble. But any conversation beyond that is going to cause a rift. It's going to cause tension. So in the 20th century, in the 21st century, when the National Park Service starts to incorporate slavery in their discussions, which was huge at Gettysburg, and I'll show you this, they're divorcing themselves from a narrative that the veterans themselves created and perpetuated. And that's fascinating because American history is created in times, right? Remember things certain ways to promote particular agendas. That happens here. So the veterans lay the foundation for the memories at Gettysburg. Let's move forward. This is an iconic image. This is the Union and Confederate veterans shaking hands over the angle where they fought on July 3rd, 1863. These are members of the Philadelphia Brigade Association, the Philadelphians. These are General Webb's men. And then the Confederates, that's Pickett's division, the Virginians who will fight here on July the 3rd. Iconic. This is a staged moment. Really exemplifies reconciliation. So through the early part of the 20th century, this is a great photograph. Gettysburg, managed by the War Department, is a landscape for reconciliation, but the other thing that the War Department wants out of Gettysburg is a landscape that has utilitarian value. What the heck is this? In 1914, Europe descends into war, and the United States gets involved in the Great War in April of 1917. And the War Department looks at Civil War battlefields, a couple thousand acres now at Gettysburg, and they think, wow, those wide open spaces, guess what? They're great for tank training. Tank training. So here in the middle of Pickett's Charge, like envision this, the fields of Pickett's Charge, here is World War I tank training. And it looks like it's not going super well, right? If you wonder why Dwight David Eisenhower, the National Park Service, Gettysburg boundary borders the Dwight David Eisenhower home, the historic house, is because young Dwight David Eisenhower, who's a captain, will be in charge of Camp Colt. So his first experience at Gettysburg is managing Camp Colt. He never gets deployed to Europe in the First World War. But he remembers this, and when it comes time for his presidency to kind of have his branch, if you will, he buys the property up in Gettysburg. So can you imagine preservationists among us running tanks through Civil War battlefields today? This makes us cringe. doesn't it? Makes us cringe. But that's the War Department philosophy. How can we use these lands? And we'll see this come through in the Park Service too. So the War Department manages the battlefield until 1933. The War Department manages all the big 5 Civil War sites until 1933. And then under the new presidential administration, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the National Park Service will acquire Gettysburg. And the timing here is important. So this is August of 1933, and if you think about what's going on in the United States in the early 1930s, you would think of what? The Great Depression. And Roosevelt has these famous alphabet agencies. You remember these in high school, right? The TVA, the CCC, the NRA. You have to memorize all them, right? They all run together, right? So ironically, when I was doing my research, I thought, you know, the Roosevelt administration acquiring this site in 1933, Gettysburg's really going to flounder. But ironically, the Great Depression ends up being a positive for Gettysburg and for the National Park Service. Here's the first Park Service superintendent on the left. And here he's talking with 2 Civil War veterans. The first National Park Service superintendent is James McConaughey. And what I would tell you about James McConaughey is that he's a Harvard graduate, impressive, but his background is a landscape architecture, right? And one of the things that struck me in my dissertation research and then moving deeper and making this a book is how much one person's background or influence determines how the park is managed. So for McConaughey as a landscape architect, he is worried, and he's there until 1941, about making the Gettysburg battlefield beautiful. He manages it as a landscape. So you would see if you scroll through the old microfilm for the newspapers in Gettysburg in the 1930s, the Park Service is putting out promotions to get people to come to visit Gettysburg, not to, learn about history or learn about the Civil War. They're putting out promotions and advertisements to get people to come to Gettysburg to see the beautiful foliage. Come see how pretty Devil's Den is in the fall, or come see the beautiful budding trees in the spring, because that's his philosophy. He writes a document that says that the monuments put up by the veterans themselves are an obstruction to the landscape. And he favors planting trees and flowers to obscure the monuments. So my point is, when we think about preservation, and you all think about preservation, think about how your own background can really influence and shape what we see. And this guy's legacy is incredible. So he's there until 1941. But before we get him out, and before we get to 1941, I mentioned that the National Park Service, Gettysburg included, really benefit from the Great Depression, because all those make-work projects that FDR is promoting, a lot of them are going to be in state and local parks. And you know this, federal parks, the whole entire Shenandoah Valley, the Blue Ridge Parkway is a Great Depression New Deal project. And Gettysburg is ripe for these kind of make-work projects. This is the CCC. This is in McMillan Woods. So if you can imagine in your mind the Confederate battle line along Seminary Ridge, this is going to be one of the CCC camps. The second camp is going to be in Pitzer's Woods. Some of you know where this is. It's where that little tiny James Longstreet monument is, a little squash Longstreet monument. All right, so that's interesting. So the CCC camp has 2 locations at Gettysburg. You'd find that in a lot of state and a lot of national parks, Shiloh, Vicksburg, all included. What's different about Gettysburg is the kind of workers who are there, the kind of laborers who are toiling on the Gettysburg battlefield. This is a photograph of some of the manual work that the CCC enrollees will do. They will update the roads. They will modernize the infrastructure. I'll flip back to this. They will clean up the monuments. They will build really important structures, one of which I bet you've used if you've ever toured around the Gettysburg battlefield. This is one of the, we call them comfort stations, right? It's one of the restrooms. You can think of where the Pennsylvania Memorial is. This is that restroom, those small buildings. And if you look at the photograph, what strikes you? In that one or this one? They're black, yes. Gettysburg is going to be a testing ground for all black CCC camps. And in addition to black laborers, I have one more photograph. In addition to the black laborers, their supervisor is also African American. And that's deliberate. This is high-level Washington, D.C., picking Gettysburg as the place where they put not only black laborers, but also black supervisors as a, if you will, new birth of freedom, as Lincoln tells us. And by all accounts, they integrated seamlessly with the local population. The locals loved them because they did a lot of good work. Here they are painting the fence that separates the Soldiers' National Cemetery from the Evergreen Cemetery. So they do a lot of good modern projects. And the CCC, think about this, they will have employees or laborers at Gettysburg until 1942 when young men are needed elsewhere by then. So by the time the Great Depression hits, Gettysburg has over 3,000 acres now. So over 3,000. They've got 25 miles of park road, and Gettysburg has over 1,000 monuments. So it's a bigger park to upkeep. And the Great Depression, ironically, helps facilitate those preservation objectives. Now, that conversation is going to change a little bit in 1941. So I go through my dissertation research, and I'm writing chronologically, and I'm kind of expecting some periods to be a little more interesting than others, right? We go in with kind of preconceived notions. And I get into the 1940s. I'm a military historian, so I'm very interested in World War II, of course. But I get into the 1940s, and I think, yeah, that's not going to be all that exciting. What really can we say about how Gettysburg feels World War II? Or how does World War II change the interpretation of Gettysburg? And what strikes me is Gettysburg's preservation, Gettysburg's history, does not evolve in a vacuum. Right? We do not preserve or think about Gettysburg or think about any history without our own political, economic, and social times influencing us. So in the 1941 to 1945, the Second World War is really important to the management of the Gettysburg battlefield in a couple ways. This needs no introduction, right? Roosevelt tells the United States people after World War II, after Pearl Harbor, rather, that the United States will be the arsenal of democracy, right? We're going to be the arsenal of democracy. That in order to defeat totalitarianism and fascism, Nazism, all around the globe, the United States needs to modernize and be able to project power all around the world, right? The arsenal of democracy. Mobilized overnight, Rosie the Ripper. And in order to get the materials to make those Liberty ships, for example, you need to have endless amounts of scrap metals, right? And you know this, right? The big drive for the scrap drives during the Second World War. Well, the Civil War battlefields are good places to start to pick surplus material. This is Gettysburg in 1943. All right, here's your park ranger, and here's some of your laborers going around the battlefield and taking surplus Civil War materials to donate to the scrap drive. Vicksburg does this too. Gettysburg's the biggest, really the biggest park at this time with the most stuff, if you will, ornamental Civil War stuff. And the National Park Service at Gettysburg will donate about 18 tons of material to the scrap drive. One of the most interesting documents I found in the archives is one written by the National Park Service management at Gettysburg that is a plan, it's itemized, that would disassemble the entire commemorative structure at Gettysburg should the war get that bad. Meaning, they had itemized every monument and marker on the Gettysburg battlefield in order of tearing it down and scrapping it. And the last two monuments that they said, these are the most important monuments on the battlefield, they will not be scrapped, come hell or high water, they will not be scrapped. The last two were the state monument to Alabama and the state monument to North Carolina. So they picked two Confederate monuments because of their, quote, artistic merit, right? But all the other ones were a little higher up in the pecking order. Now we know it doesn't come to be that bad, but that shows you what the philosophy is at that time, that these parks can be utilitarian or used to ways that meet contemporary needs or pressing needs. Fascinating insight to preservation philosophy, because you need stuff like that. You need stuff like this. So preservation, disassembling the commemorative landscape at Gettysburg is an important part of World War II. Here they are, same idea. This no way looks like you see the Gettysburg battlefield today. So much of the commemorative ornamentation has been removed. You know, when you visit Shiloh and you visit the artillery positions, how they have the pyramid of the cannonballs? Gettysburg used to have those too, until the scrap drive. Right? So that's why they're absent, but you'll see them at other Civil War parks. Interesting insight. This is a photograph in October 1943. So I showed you the one of the tank Camp Colt in 1917 about how these big open spaces, the fields of Pickett's Charge are perfect for this, how these large open spaces can be used by the War Department for training of officers. That's part of the War Department philosophy. This is the fields of Pickett's Charge. You can probably recognize, here's the Cadore Barn, right? It's important on July the 3rd. So here it's used as training ground for chemical warfare. These men are expecting that they're going to be deployed to Europe somewhere, and here they are on the fields of Pickett's Charge practicing for conditions that they expect to encounter in Europe. Visitation in the Second World War era is very minimal, right? Because the Roosevelt administration puts all sorts of restrictions on travel and gasoline and rationing. So most of the people visiting the Gettysburg battlefield between 1941 and 1945 are soldiers getting ready to deploy somewhere or the other, training ground. So that's going on. Maybe more interesting, and this kind of gets back to the question of memory, is how Americans think about Gettysburg during the Second World War. How they think about Lincoln, how they think about the fight, how they think about Union and Confederate soldiers. This is government propaganda. I show a lot of propaganda to my students. I find it fascinating. This is government propaganda to enlist. And who are they quoting to get men to enlist after Pearl Harbor? Lincoln, that these dead shall not have died in vain. Remember December the 7th. So the government is maligning or using or propagandizing Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address to get men to enlist. They do the same thing to buy Liberty bonds. Look at the bottom. The government of the people, by the people, shall not perish from the earth. So Lincoln sees a surge of popularity during the Second World War because the federal government is using the Gettysburg Address to make people think about sacrifice. And they're using the Gettysburg Address to make people think about government of the people and by the people rings pretty true whenever you look around the globe in the 1940s and you see civil liberties being squashed out in Western Europe or in Asia. So this is a clarion call to patriotism, but it puts the Civil War back in the national discourse. That's fascinating. Historical memory is fascinating. So moving through the 20th century, the Second World War's an interesting conversation about preservation. 1945, the war is over, and you know what happens in the United States after World War II? People have this huge economic boom, right? The economy booms, the baby boom generation, and people are going to vacation, right? They're going to travel, right? The automobile becomes more ubiquitous. People are going to take summer vacations. They're going to visit national parks. They're going to visit Gettysburg. Now, this should really make the preservationists among us, our inner preservationists, cringe. If you go to Gettysburg today, and we all do this, I do this, I'm there still every summer, you'll kind of groan a little bit about, you know, the McDonald's that you can see in the fields of Pickett's Charge and the Kentucky Fried Chicken that's just on the outskirts of the fields of Pickett's Charge. But in the 1950s, Gettysburg is littered with commercial development. This is the first day's field. And if you can kind of zone in on what's going on here, this is the Chambersburg Pike. Here's the John Fulton Reynolds and John Buford Monument. So we're right out on day one. And you got gas stations, you have hotels on the battlefield. Here, this is the Peace Light, this is day one. Here's the Peace Light, where you can stay and eat drink cocktails rather, eat seafood and get some beer. So all throughout, and this is the trickery part about preservation, right? You want people to come to your site, so you have to have amenities. And throughout the battlefield, you would find all sorts of these ice cream kind of stands, I say littering the battlefield, but definitely a surge in commercialization. So the 1950s gives people free time, vacation, right? Take to the road, explore America, uber patriotism in the height of the Cold War, right? In the 1950s also sees a surge of interest in the Civil War because the United States is moving towards the Civil War Centennial. You all are probably members of Civil War roundtables, right? You've been to Civil War roundtables. They really take off in the 1950s and into the 1960s. The reenactment culture takes off in the 1950s. The North-South Skirmish Association is born in this era. And Americans are moving to the centennial with an eye towards, and semantics are important, commemorating, but also celebrating the Civil War. And this is fascinating because the 1960s Civil War Centennial overlays the Civil Rights Movement. So any conversation about the Civil War has to be placed into this divisive racial conversation of the 1960s. The image on the left is Freedom Riders in Anniston, Alabama, and this is one of the promotion pieces, Civil War Centennial stamps with malice towards none. The Civil War Centennial's slogan is "A Nation United," which is much more idealistic than practical. It doesn't really reflect the reality. So the Centennial at Gettysburg, the nation's eyes turn to Gettysburg. If you'd pick up road maps or flip through magazines or flip through CBS, your news channels, they're all talking about Gettysburg. Visit Gettysburg, visit Gettysburg. And the National Park Service at Gettysburg is preparing for the biggest onslaught of visitors of the 20th century. This is the first time their visitation tops 2 million. Right, unparalleled or unprecedented visitation. And there's a lot going on. This is the Confederate monument to the state of Georgia. And if you visit Gettysburg, we talked about monuments and about how McConaughey views them as kind of impediment to the landscape. If you visit Gettysburg, you note, everywhere you look, there are monuments, right? Mostly Northern or Union monuments that were put up about 25 years after in the 1880s. Confederate states are a little slow to come to the monument craze. They don't have the money for it, and they're not too eager to commemorate a battle that they lost, right, in a Union state. But in the Civil War Centennial, there's this surge of interest among Southerners about Gettysburg. So a lot of the monuments, when you drive down Confederate Avenue, Seminary Ridge, like this one, go up in the 1960s. And this is part of this big conversation today about Confederate monuments, their contested legacies today. So here's the governor of Georgia erecting the monument to the state of Georgia. Georgia's goes up, Florida's will be erected at Gettysburg at the same time. The President of the United States, this is John Kennedy standing on Little Round Top, will come and visit Gettysburg in March, right? The nation's attention is turning to Gettysburg. The Park Service opens a new museum for the occasion. If you look to the right, here we are. This is the Park Service, we would call it the Cyclorama Center, but if you've been there prior to 2008, you know that building. That's where the painting of Pickett's Charge is. All the white, these are all cars, right? All cars, massive onslaught of visitation. And Gettysburg has about 2 weeks of commemorative activities, so late June into the 10th or so of July. Monument dedications, parades. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson comes to Gettysburg and delivers a speech. Former President Dwight David Eisenhower comes to Gettysburg, delivers a speech. Big deal. March with Kennedy's visit. And then the big event is the reenactment, right? The multi-day reenactment where Union and Confederate reenactors will draw tens of thousands of spectators to simulate what their actions were like 100 years ago. So all this is going on at Gettysburg, and in the context of the civil rights conversation. So I told you that after the war is over and we move into this period of reconciliation with Union and Confederate veterans coming back, we would drop ourselves into that conversation on East Cemetery Hill, and we would find the Union and Confederate veterans talking about deeds on the battlefield, acts of heroism and courage and honor and bravery. What they were not talking about is slavery. They're not talking about Jim Crow. They're not talking about secession. But the Civil War Centennial is an opportunity to insert a conversation about race into the Civil War. And some people do it. New Jersey governor will come to Gettysburg and he will rededicate a monument, a New Jersey monument, down on Cemetery Ridge. And he gives this passing in his dedication speech, shadowing what he views or believed Union soldiers were fighting for. The war is not fought to preserve Union lily white or Jim Crow, it's fought for liberty and justice. And there they are at the Woolworth counter. So if you move this conversation forward, let's get to the present day and kind of make some lasting takeaways. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, will be also at Gettysburg for the Centennial. We get this conversation to the present day. The Civil War Centennial, the Park Service moves through the 70s and 80s without a lot of change, preservation or otherwise. But here we are in the modern day. And the National Park Service in 1994 gets a new superintendent. This is John Latcher. He has a PhD in American history from Rutgers, Army veteran. Latcher is going to spearhead a movement that puts slavery and the causes of the Civil War in the Park Service's interpretations at Gettysburg. In 2000, Congress will mandate that exact objective. This is a congressional mandate that Civil War sites will be forced to recognize or include in their public displays the unique role that the institution of slavery played in causing the American Civil War. How many of you have been to the new museum? The new museum at Gettysburg? Have you been to the old one? Very different museums, right? Very different museums. So now, when you visit Gettysburg, this private-public partnership to the tune of $135 million visitor center, you walk into this museum and you get an entire conversation about the American Civil War. You get a conversation about secession, you get a conversation about Fort Sumter, you get slavery, you get reconciliation, you get Jim Crow, you get Gettysburg, you get the entire war. You get a lot more social cultural context than you had gotten before. And this makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Jerry Russell was one of the leading preservationists of the 20th century, saying that is not the place to talk about slavery. Battlefields are about honor. And you see this conversation still today about contested legacies. So the National Park Service pushes a different interpretive trajectory into the 20th century that's contested. The other part of the Park Service management of our era, the recent era, is a quest to restore the battlefield, the landscape, to as close as possible to what it looked like in 1863. So here's that tower being erected in 1974, and Bruce Catton says it's an obstruction. It's in the shadows in the National Cemetery. Hopefully it goes down. People gripe when it goes up. People gripe when it comes down, right? That's my simple nutshell message of Gettysburg preservation. You're not, what does Lincoln say? You can't appease all the people all the time, some of the people some of the time. So here's going down July 3rd, 2000. And because of this national conversation about slavery and civil rights and should it be put into these Civil War battlefields, Gettysburg is also at the forefront of this landscape rehabilitation process. And this is amazing. This is some of the controversy. Visitors don't care whether trees were there in 1863. The Gettysburg battlefield is not an arboretum. It's not a bird sanctuary. So people have different views of how Gettysburg should be managed. But if you walk onto the Gettysburg battlefield today, you can feel pretty sure that the landscape that you're seeing in terms of fence line, the kind of fences, the orchards, the kind of orchards planted there are pretty similar to what soldiers would have seen in 1863. That's amazing. And I'll show you a few photos yet that demonstrate this, and you can think of this in your own trips to Gettysburg. This is an artillery position of Federal guns on Devil's Den towards the Alabama-Georgia assault on July the 2nd. This is what it looked like before it was clear-cut. That's what it looks like after. I told you I worked at the Park Service for 9 summers, and this is right when all these changes are going on. And it was so amazing to see this happen. And now, when you visit Gettysburg and you can see all these non-historic woodlots removed, you can better understand the tactics and the fight that occurred there those 3 days in July. But it's incredibly controversial. It's incredibly controversial because Gettysburg means different things to different people. So that's the Valley of Death. We're looking down towards Little Round Top, the Devil's Den area. Here you can see one of those restrooms that we talked about that the CCC puts up. Here they are demolishing it. So they clear-cut non-historic woodlots, and that bathrooms would stand out like a sore thumb, and that's going to be removed. And more recently, the Visitor Center, what used to be the Visitor Center that opened in 1920, was torn down. That would be the one that some of you remember going into, across the street from the Soldiers' National Monument Cemetery. That's torn down, and now that old cyclorama building is torn down, which is also very controversial because there were some architectural preservationists who wanted the building saved for its architecture significance. So preservation means different things to different people, right? I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You don't live in your own way. And now if you visit Gettysburg, you'll see a battlefield that looks different, really different than it did 10 years, certainly 15 years ago. This is the ground where the old Visitor Center once was, and it's now being restored to what it looked like July 2nd, 3rd, 1863, and there's your Kentucky Fried Chicken that people will still grumble about. So all of that, 150 plus years later, 3 different administrators, the National Park Service being the longest and the most recent, the battlefield's history is incredibly eclectic. It's incredibly diverse. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain says that Gettysburg is a place where something stays, right? This is a battlefield that's an incredibly important place to tens of thousands of people, and the preservation of it, very important, very important. So I hope in 45 minutes I covered an incredibly complex topic. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a trajectory of my research and of a site that you're interested in. So thank you. Anyways, let me say that. Thank you for listening and hanging in there with me. I appreciate it. Thank you for hanging out here with me on a Monday evening. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming out, y'all.